source. So the wells that would be put in are assumed to be 300-plus deep bedrock wells that would be put in. So the assessment was really focused on that system, the bedrock water. The recharge and the water supply to that is assumed to be within that, the watershed around there, so that the contributing factor would be water that would be in the brooks and streams to the Cohos that would recharge the bedrock system.
So this is just not looking at the Lorden property itself, this is looking,
We looked at it from both perspectives, to be conservative. We looked strictly as a square footage of the development itself, looked at the amount of water available from recharge and stuff within the boundaries of the property itself, but we also drew a kind of a conservative, small sub-basin watershed, as you say, that we're assuming that the water that would fall from rain precipitation in that watershed would contribute, or has the potential of contributing to the bedrock wells.
okay. Thank you. Any more to the presentation?
Yes, we're finished.
Oh, okay,
There have been
So
no
you're-
changes to the plan since last one.
okay. So we're just talking about
Thank you.
water. So I'll start with John. We'll do staff, we'll do the board, and then we'll go to the public.
Again, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, again, this was, just to summarize, again, the application had been accepted as complete on March 2nd. Waivers were granted also at that particular public hearing.
Oh, hey, John, could you move the microphone closer to you?
Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Conditional use permit was granted again on April 13th, 2011. There is one sewer utility note. Chinburg is proposing this conservation subdivision as permitted by the town of Londonderry zoning ordinance. The proposed housing density of the subdivision is permissible only with a community or public sanitary sewer collection system are proposed to be located within the town's future right-of-way. The sanitary sewer system servicing this area is being proposed to be operated by the Lorden Common Sewer Company, LLC, a private sewage disposal service subject to the New Hampshire PUC approval and regulations, recommending that precedent condition number, or please see the recommended precedent condition number 2 below. As far as the hydrogeologic, again, at the April 13th planning board meeting, the board directed the applicant to provide documentation relative to the ability of the site to support the individual wells proposed for servicing the lots. The applicant hired a hydrogeologist to evaluate the proposed development and provided the town with a report with their findings. The town's consultant, Stantec, had the report reviewed by their hydrogeologist. And based on a review of the hydrogeology report, there appears to be sufficient recharge to support the development of the initial 50 lots proposed in Phase 1. The review does raise questions relative to the methodology used and whether or not the recharge is sufficient to support the full build-out of the proposed 133 lots. And staff recommends that the issues raised about full build-out of the project be addressed prior to submission of future phases of the development. That's all I'm going to go through right now.
Okay. Okay. Andre?
No, I have nothing further. Go ahead.
Okay. Tim?
Now, just to state that based on the review of the hydrogeology report, we are comfortable that the 50 lots that are before you here tonight are supportable. We would recommend conditional approval of the application. We do note that we are proposing a general condition that would be that the applicant will meet with the town staff and the review consultant to address the issues raised in the review of the hydrogeology report as it relates to the ability of the development to support the wells for the full build-out of the project prior to the submission of the application for future phases of the development to the planning board. There are some questions, I think, that need to be worked out between the professionals and the hydrogeology standpoint, but in terms of the initial 50 lots that are before you here tonight, there is sufficient water recharge and ability to service those 50 lots.
Okay, so there is an agreement between
At the 50 lot
general
level, yes.
agreement, the 50
For what is
lots
proposed here today. The full build-out is where we have some questions related to the
Getting into the
methodology that we
details.
need to work out.
Okay. Okay, I'll start, Chris, we'll go through the board, and we'll go through the public after that.
Well, a couple of questions around the whole wells. I presume there'd be drilling and hydrofracturing. Has there been any study from Santec on what that's gonna do to the surrounding water supply for other wells in there? Because, I've had folks drill next door and they've had to go down 1,200 feet because of, just to get a decent flow in, and I'm not far away from that, I'm just the other side of I-95. And, we have had reports of, when the hydrofracturing occurs, that it affects the other wells. So these are all gonna be very close to each other. So if you start adding other wells in there, they're gonna be going to the same, penetrating the same area. And the other question was, a single system, what would be involved in terms of cost to do a single system for this? I mean, I'd like to see what's, is it that much cheaper to drill 133 wells versus a water supply system for the
And the
development?
complicating factor to all this, there are state regulations for a community system where we'd be able to apply existing state rules and regulations.
Yeah, 'cause
For
you'd have to have-
individual wells, there really is no state guidance.
Yeah, you'd have to have
in terms
periodic
of
testing and all of
regulations.
that stuff going on, right?
And the
Yeah.
so it's a
I used to live in a
difficult,
condo.
it's a difficult position to be put in terms of reviewing this type of report where there really are no rules and regulations from which we can base our review on.
I think with the, it's up to this board, I think, it's by our own design that we've got a development that can have this kind of density, and all of a sudden we're dealing with, that there's no rules, but we can apply what we need.
Right, I mean, I think you gotta take some of the professional, information and then, kind of put it,
The concern I've got is that, yes, they'll support 50, but, when they go to the 133?
yeah, that's, I think, a whole nother thing.
Yeah. It'd be better to, have it
Which
done
we don't
right
have any
first.
answers for it right
Yeah.
now. Rick?
Nothing further to add.
Okay. Tom?
If you could help me with something, you guys, 'cause I went into law because I couldn't do science, so. It
Tom?
appears that under
Oh,
less,
could you get the mic closer
yeah,
there?
it appears that under less than normal drought conditions, less than normal to drought conditions, the project at build-out will likely lead to lower water levels both on-site and off-site, and will likely result in withdrawal from beneath the abutting land. That means they're taking waters from,
As any well in any lot would do, yes.
so that happens all the time,
Yes.
to this extent?
Anytime you have a drought condition, I'm not a hydrogeologist, but when you.
Well, it's not just drought conditions, it's less than normal, it's, according to the
I
memo.
would not feel comfortable answering that question. That's why we hired the hydrogeologist to review.
Well,
Jack?
generally, no, it's pretty standard that you are drawing the water table down. The only condition that the state puts on, so obviously, every well is affecting the water table to some degree. The only criteria that the state has is if, you significantly draw down a well that impacts another well, that they can't produce the water that they need. And in this case, there are very little, wells existing, and so it's, you're
Okay,
talking
if I can-
minor drawdowns that would occur. Again, in terms of the future build-out of the whole thing, it's my opinion that even with the 133, it wouldn't, significantly make an impact. But certainly looking at that down the road with the second stage is, something that,
Oh, okay, well, because I'm reading a little further here, and it
Sure.
says, if this total withdrawal was from a proposed public water supply, it would be considered by DES to be a large withdrawal, so it's not a minor thing. Just
Right,
because there's
but
no
that-
public water supply next to it, it would be considered a large withdrawal.
yeah, again, but there are, how the state considers it is individual wells by private owners is not a production well that would be considered a large withdrawal or anything like that. So they look at individual wells being a very low yield not a constant demand, so you're looking at a very, up to like 2 gallons a minute range. And that only goes on at peak periods of use in the home. Rather, a large well, a production well or something, you're continuously pumping at a continuous rate, which would continuously draw down the water table over a large period of time. Individual well, you're gonna draw it down for a couple minutes, 15, 20 minutes while the shower is going or something like that, or doing your wash. But as soon as you stop, obviously that water's starting to rebound. So it's not a continuous withdrawal, and that's kind of how the state views individual private wells. Again, when you look at it, they look at it as, okay, you're using one production well continuously, that would be considered a significant withdrawal, and they do have a permit process for such wells.
Right, and if I just might add something, the individual wells are in much smaller spheres of influence. They're spaced out, spread all over. A large community system well would be in one location drawing intensely at only that one spot, as opposed to in 50 different locations.
But if your development is drawing water from a neighboring person's land, I mean, is that what's happening?
But that's how water, that's a withdrawal is,
Well, maybe you can do it, maybe it's legal to do it, but does it affect the other guy?
again, unless, going back to, no, it does not.
Right.
Again,
Well,
the
I mean,
state-
isn't
state-
water a finite amount?
No,
And
there's
if-
excess water.
that's what-
The report shows that there's excess water coming from the rainfall, landing on the ground, percolating through the soil to recharge this location. There's,
Right. What we're saying is that there's a pool of water that constantly is recharged from precipitation. And the balance of what is coming down is recharge versus what is being withdrawn.
And it doesn't
is
affect his
surplus.
pressure or anything?
No.
He doesn't even notice this happening?
No.
Okay.
I mean, and actually, the state has just, DES has just come up with lots of long-term monitoring, actually, of the whole state, particularly in the seacoast area, where this very concern came up and said, well, we've got all these wells, private wells that are pumping, is the water table in the state drawing down, or is in specific areas of the state? And what they've actually found is, no, over the last 20, 30 years, the water levels in most of the state of New Hampshire are actually staying stable, even with the large growth of development along particularly the seacoast area. So, no, it does not. The concern comes again in a production well where you constantly are removing a large volume. And the concern there is somehow that drawdown extending past your recharge boundary, extending past that bucket of water that you've got. And that's where the state is.
Will that happen if the full development is built out, 133 homes?
My opinion is no. I understand the town's consultant, would rather have some further documentation of that, on the next stage.
we can work on that.
Yeah, that's something, I understand the disagreement there or whatever, and that's fine. We can certainly work on developing, something more
We'll address
comprehensive.
that.
Yeah.
Thank
But, again, my personal opinion is that it would not. But again, we can certainly look at that more in detail.
Thank you.
Is that, Dana?
Refresh my memory, please. I know that during the conceptual, you came in using public water. What's the number of homes you lose if you stay with public water?
In terms of where they can't get the water
Right.
to?
Oh. I don't know for sure. It was the high spot. Yeah, maybe half of the lots. I'm not real sure.
What precludes you from using public water where you can and using wells for those that you can't?
It's a cost factor, for sure. That affects the subdivision. Feasibility, it's, yeah.
What happens if we find after this first phase that the water table will not support the full build-up?
Then I guess we'll have to deal with that. We'll have to address it one way or another. I don't know if Eric wants to speak to it, but.
Okay, yeah.
Eric Chinberg of Chinberg Builders. I mean, obviously, we're here for a phased approval. We're seeking a conditional approval tonight for phase one. It's the only part of the overall that's fully designed. We know that nothing else has been approved. The fact that we have a conceptual build, it doesn't mean you're giving us permission for that. We believe fully, based on our report, that we will be able to work through these issues with Stantec and prove to them that there's no issue at full build-out. But we haven't proved that to the satisfaction of the town yet. Therefore, we're not asking you to give us anything to do with that yet. If it turns out that for whatever reason it was definitively determined that it's not feasible and somehow would be damaging, then obviously you wouldn't approve the subsequent phases.
Okay. That's it.
You guys have answered the questions I was going to ask.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
It's fine.
I'm all set at this point.
Okay, Laura? Okay.
I had the same question as Dana, but it sounds answered.
May I have just a follow-up question on not using well water and going with a public water supply? The reason why you're not going to be able to hit is because of elevation?
Yes, it's the elevation of the water tank that's out by exit 5, someplace that.
Is there a way to use a supplemental pumping system, like a pump house or something for the project, to boost the pressure for the remaining lots?
That would be cost prohibitive as well for us.
That would be.
Yep.
Have you explored that?
Mhm.
Any abutters, anyone from the public have any questions, comments, concerns?
I have one question, too.
Okay,
If,
Chris,
if,
then I'll-
if on the build-out, you do the first 50 and, you've got problems with wells, or, that's where it ends. My concern is that, 5 years or somewhere down the line, they've not got enough water because now the conditions have changed. We've ended up with developments in town that had problems with, septic and with water, that, they were left high and dry. And that's my concern of, that the conservation district or subdivision was designed to be fed by public to give the density, right?
No. It was designed to allow for varying different lot standards in terms of minimum lot size, whether you had private well, private septic, private wells with municipal sewer, or public water and public sewer.
Okay.
There are varying lot standards based on all of those different scenarios.
So the difference, when it became for us for conceptual, it was on public, all right.
That was the
Yeah,
initial.
that was the
Yeah,
initial.
all right.
Yes.
That would be my concern, is that, it gets partially built and then, there's problems with it. And
Yes,
what do the
and,
people that have bought the places do at that point?
and as we remember, when we were here with the conceptual, we had not yet finished our investigative work with Manchester Waterworks. We were talking to them, trying to get information from them to see what would develop with that aspect of it. And it proved not to be feasible, unfortunately.
Okay. Chuck?
Chuck DeRossi, Old Dairy Road. First observation, I think if you review the tapes of previous meeting, I think you knew then it was only 15 or 20 houses that were affected by the using public water. And then I believe Mr. Wiles had asked, because one of the issues brought up was that it was illegal to use a boost pump, and you wanted some proof of that. Well, now that story's changed. A little concern there. That was just a peripheral thing. But nevertheless, I'm not a water specialist by any means. I've lived in that area for over 30 years. In the last 5, 2 out of those, I've started sucking silt out. And I know with a well, I guess I should pay to hydrofrack or go down 1 million feet. But I've never had the issue before, And when water is tight, we don't water our lawns in the neighborhood. We don't have sprinkler systems. We try to, and it's been fine. This year's fine. There's been plenty of rain. So I don't understand how, by adding this draw, and I know they're little wells, but when you accumulate, and the total, you should look at this project as a total build-out, because why allow 1/3 of it and then find out it's no good, then you have to bring in water? Just accommodate the whole project, or don't accommodate it, I guess is my suggestion. But when you've got 133 houses sucking water at the same time, that's like using a community well. They don't all just use a little bit, and then the next guy, they're all taking showers in the morning, doing their laundry at night. It's a large drawdown. I've had a couple of opportunities to talk to some people that are in the water field, because I'm not, and I guess maybe this gentleman can confer, and maybe they're lying to me, but I had posed in the scenario that if there was a large draw on the water table and it brought it down, could that conceivably cause water to leach from a lower level from the water the way it was flowing back? And they said it was not often, but it's not impossible. Now, if that did happen and it drawed down, and then you had water siphoning back from the old Derry Auburn Roadfill landfill site, then that's going to contaminate all our wells and the wells there. Which, again, I know it's a small possibility. I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong. And these two guys, I guess I'll, they said that if I pay them, I'll get a report in writing. But, and again, they said that it doesn't usually happen, but they said it's possible. So you can confirm that or you can deny it. Whatever you can do is up to you. So that brings up an issue. Also, in my time since the last meeting, I decided to trek up to the Derry side, which is just up the road from the project, because before this, it was rumor. I was wondering why Derry had paid to put people on town water there, and knocked on a couple of houses, and I said, how come you guys are on town water now? I said, did you have a shortage of water? And they go, no, which I was under the misconception they did. But I guess the problem they did have is Scobie Pond had a contamination issue that contaminated the water all over the area there, so the town paid to put everybody on the water. Now, Scobie Pond is up from the project, so I don't know if they investigated that at all about that contamination, but you got contamination on both ends. And like I said, water is a very important resource. It's going to be like, more important than gasoline is. That's what we live on, and it's very precious. Its property values are nothing without the water. So I think you need to consider, for the safety of the neighborhood, that you need to require that this be a public water source. Because the other thing you have to understand too is we were sucking silt out of the ground for the couple of the years in the last 5, and that's with everybody in my neighborhood. Not only do we get the rainwater to bring the water table up, but also we have septic systems that the water goes, most of the water isn't consumed. It's usually used in various ways, and it goes back in the ground through our septic systems. And I know they don't use that as a factor, but that's got to help the water table. Now, if you take this whole project, that water is coming out of the ground and going right out a tube into the river. It's not even getting leached back in. So, with all those considerations, and we're worried about having some apple trees at this other big orchard, I think the least we could do is require town water for a big project like this. And we should look at it as a whole project, not as phase 1, and then if it doesn't work, we'll bring in water later. I don't think the town wants to foot the bill for that, and I don't think that the rest of us around there should be put in that position. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have infiltration beds for each house from the roof water, which is being recharged into the ground, and the state alteration of terrain permit, which is the drainage permit, which we're still waiting for, also requires that we recharge volume of water into the ground, which we're doing through a gravel wetland. Those additions are not counted on top of the rainfall information that Jack used for the analysis.
Okay, anyone else? Mike?
I'm going to be brief. I wasn't aware that Stantec already had some issues with this report, so I'm going to just cover it very lightly, and Jack, you can correct me if I make a mistake. But this is a simple calculation, and you should remember that it didn't talk about hydrofracking. It says strictly how much water comes down, how much can we keep, how much do we use, and making that subtraction. And they used an assumption from a USGS report that basically looked at a whole bunch of watersheds. Each one of those lines is a watershed, and they picked a conservative number and assumed that 8 inches of urea could be captured into the aquifer. and in most years, that's good. So this is really a question of risk. There's about 3 inches of margin right now. If these numbers are right, and there's 28 million gallons of margin, if the assumption proved to be false, and it wasn't 8 inches of recharge, it was only 5 inches, then you're to the point where you're sucking silt. So it's a question of how much risk you want to assume that there'll be a series of dry years. In the wintertime, you only get, those 3 months, maybe a half inch, an inch, maybe 2 inches of water. Fortunately, it's a big pool and it doesn't go up and down with the seasons that much. But you need to think about, are you okay if they're dry only 1 year in 10? Should it be 1 year in 100? So there has to be some margin, I think, in this data. And when you pick off a study like this, you've got to be, I think, very, very conservative in what number you assume you're going to get every year.
Yeah, because I think I'd be more comfortable to see what the error bars are,
Yeah,
Right.
generally, the numbers that are there are not only in that document, but pretty much documented through all the research that's been done in the last several years in not only New Hampshire, but Maine and in Massachusetts and pretty much New England. Those studies look at, he is correct, you have several years of drought and so forth, and go back and forth, but they look at averages across, a blocks of period of time. So that 8 inches is an average number. So it's built in to be conservative in the fact that some years you have 15, 20 inches. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a lot more than that, 12, 15 inches of recharge to the rock. And then other years, we've had years back to the early 2001, 2002 that were pretty dry years. So you get an average, and I'm not going to deny that you could have a couple of years of drought. So that's why they use an average rate, and that's pretty standard assumption in New England. The other piece that's really conservative is the water use. Typically, the state of New Hampshire requires you to look at, use basically the septic rules in looking at water supply, water use for residential homes. And they use 150 gallons per bedroom, which I've been working in New Hampshire for 20-some years, and I've never seen a house that uses 150 gallons per bedroom a day. Usually it's in the 50 to 75 gallon a day range. If you have 5 or 6 bedrooms or something like that, or you have a lot of people in the house or something, you may kick up to about 100. But the state requires you to use 150, and so that's what we used as the amount of water used per household, which is a very, very conservative number. So if you look at the average recharge and you build in the conservative withdrawal rate.
Didn't you also use 4 bedrooms?
And we use 4 bedrooms, right, we assume that every.
So it's 150 gallons times 4
for each household.
Dwelling unit.
So our assumption was 600 gallons per day per unit. And these are going to be 2- and 3-bedroom homes, probably using 50 to 75 gallons per bedroom per day, which would be a third of that. So there's all sorts of assumptions built in that already have the safety factors that this gentleman was talking about.
And also, as John says, we didn't even consider the recharge from the infiltration of surface water runoff and so forth. So that's another piece that adds to that. So I feel that the numbers we use are real conservative, and again, you could go back for technically, you might have a year that you are not recharging more than 4 or 5 inches, but again, you'll have another year that you're getting 12, 14 inches a year of recharge. So it is an average on that.
Yeah, I think that the silting thing would be the water rising up and down in the well, which means the water table is fluctuating
Yeah,
down.
but in the bedrock, I mean, silt generally, I mean, it's a gray area. There are some areas where your fractures do seal up over time, and you start dragging silt in and plugging things up, but generally, the impacts from a bedrock well are fairly localized. They're 50, 100 feet away from a well is where whatever impact you're seeing in your well is generally caused by that kind of thing.
And-
Nowadays, the technology, the well and drillers, years ago, they, used to put in poorly constructed casings and so forth. Nowadays, I just don't see that much silting, they go down, seek the casing in the rock pretty well, and the silt problem is typically an older well problem. I just don't see it.
Over the last 20, 25 years, I've designed probably 1,000 subdivision lots, and I haven't heard of any of them going dry. Now, maybe they don't call me back to let me know, oh, by the way, but, so I'm not sure how many you've built and not had a problem, but this is an issue every place, and our study seems to say that we have sufficient capacity.
Okay.
Chuck DeRossi again. I know the builders, the developers' thought on this is that, when you have a well, tough luck, and if you run out, you got to do what you got to do, and it's part of the cost. But again, the issues I've had were only in the dry years, and it was 2 out of 30. And I haven't had, that's it. So it's not an issue that my well is too old or it's not deep enough. It's like 300 feet down. Everything is, I test my water off, and it's fine. But it was just because it's drawn down low with the people that's there now. Now, even the town that has Stantec's look at these figures, feel these figures are a little bit overblown. I mean, they're your testing guide. Now, they're willing to not go out on a limb on the first phase. They're saying, well, that should support that, but they're telling you right up front they don't think it'll support the rest of it. And I think you have to go by that. You have to look at the project as a whole, and you have to consider the people that have been there for a long time. And I think you need to require them to go with a public water source. I don't think that there's any other way to do it.
There isn't a legally way that we can force that. I mean, we can suggest, recommend and everything, but.
Well, I guess that's fine, and then, but this is all on record, so I guess the town is on the hook. If something does happen to us, then the town's liable. I mean, why do you want to put us in that position?
We may never build phase 2, 3. It may never happen, so we're just talking about approval for phase 1.
I would just like to correct two comments that were made. One is that the town's consulting engineer didn't say that they disagreed with this report or thought it was a big risk. They said they would like to review some of the methodology that was used, and they had no issue at all with these 50 lots, and that there'll be a review of the methodology. It'll either be proved satisfactorily to them or it won't. But the other misstatement is, this is a 50-lot application. That's all we're applying. We're applying for 50 lots. We've designed this so if this is a successful project and there's sufficient water and sufficient, everything else that we need to do to design it, that we would like to build it out to 133. But you're not granting any permission for that. So you're not you've got a hydrogeologist here, you've got one representing the town who said 50 lots, not an issue, 133, we got to talk about it. But you're not going out on any limbs or taking any risks. You've done the job of getting experts to opine on this, and they've said it's fine.
Andre?
Eric addressed a lot of the concerns, given that the issue of liability came up. Again, the question was presented to the board was to look at the water. We have a 50-unit application before us, and the concern was with regard to water and the wells that are being proposed there, and whether or not that'll have an effect on the wells being proposed as well as the abutting lots. And again, we had a hydrologist present the board a report, and it had a review by our hydrologist. And I would agree with Mr. Chinberg with regard to, for the application before us, both conclude that there's ample enough water to supply those 50 lots. If they were to proceed, then the hydrologist suggested that we review the next phases with regard to the water supply and look at the methodology used for to determine whether or not there's ample enough water there. So the questions were answered, and if the board were to rely on that, with respect to what was been said, the liability issue is that we're relying on the experts that looked at that, they answered the question, and the answer to those questions was that there's ample supply of water for this application.
Anyone else from the public? Any questions, comments? Okay, I'll bring it back to the board.
Mr. Chair, if the 50 lots are built and then you came forward with the other application, could we ask for another water study at that point?
I've put that in the general and subsequent conditions, that be required prior to any future phases being presented.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, do you entertain a motion?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we conditionally approve the application or site plan for Chimberg Builders. Subdivision, excuse me, map 16, lot 38, with the following conditions as outlined in the staff recommendation letter dated May 11th, 2011.
Okay, that's the notes, recommendations, precedent conditions, general and subsequent conditions.
Correct.
Second.
Okay, motion by Dana, second by Rick. Any further discussion by the board? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Two nay votes. Okay. Abstentions, chair was affirmative, and motion carries.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Okay, next item. Get into the more conceptual discussions. We have Fritz Brown, zoning ordinance provisions related to livestock. I guess in particular it deals with chickens.
Yes.
Yes, he's a martyr for still staying here.
I'll give you guys a break. If you guys want to go home, we can do this another time. That was late.
It's all right. We'll
We'll,
very patient.
yeah, we're getting on the roll now, you know. We come awake at midnight, you know.
Fritz Brown, Thornton Road.
In your package, you'll find the request from Mr. Brown and a memorandum he's put together for you tonight.
Okay.
At this point,
Didn't notice any presentation. Okay. Letter reads as, I'd like to formally request a slot in the agenda of the planning board's next available meeting, which is occurring now. The purpose is to discuss the ordinance change to allow poultry in residential areas with less than 1 acre lot. Having never done this before, I'd humbly request your input on how to accomplish this. That is, how to write it up, verbiage, and so forth. I have feedback from neighboring towns. I have an overwhelming response to the articles and editorials, all in favor. The editor of the Derry News just called, would like to run another article editorial in this week's paper. I suggested she not use my email address. All the respondents are willing to sign a petition and/or appearing at any hearing. I trust your judgment in this matter before applying to any of them. Well,
the next page is really the discussion of what Mr. Brown is proposing.
oh, okay. And I'll let Mr. Brown do that part.
Do you have this?
Yeah, because people at home are watching this, so we need a verbal presentation also.
Oh, okay. About a month ago, my wife went to Maine and visited a friend of hers that had chickens. And she brought home about a dozen of these fresh eggs, and they were really, really good. Then I was on a flight, and I read the in-flight magazine that they have behind the seat, and it was on eggs, fresh eggs, and how there was 3 times the vitamin D, much lower cholesterol, and all that stuff, all the stuff my doctor's trying to get me to improve on. So I said, maybe we should have some chickens. So I came to the town hall and talked to Libby, Joy, and Tim, who were all very supportive, and said, "I'm sorry, Fritz, you can't have chickens here." I said, "Come on, you're kidding. I thought it was a formality, just being nice." And they said, "No, you have to have 2 acres. Other people have tried, and no one's have been able to do it." Well, I said, "That's not right." I said, "I want 3 chickens, eeny, miny, and mo. That's all I wanted, just for the grandkids, some eggs and all of that." And then when I read the ordinance, which read horses, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry, well, then I'm saying, okay, for horses and cows, I can kind of see that. But I really can't see the poultry part, because I think that's very different. So I decided to kind of appeal it and see if I couldn't help out the rest of the community, because I could have asked for a variance, which I may or may not have gotten approved. But I thought, everybody in this town, including these new people in Woodmont, I'm thinking 1,300 times 2 chickens each, and we got some. Everybody would be healthier, and I think in today's economy, I just think, hey, it's a good thing to do. I think people, maybe the old Victory Gardens from World War II might be in order, along with chickens and maybe some other, small livestock. But anyway, I decided to write a editorial to the local newspapers, which they were gracious enough to accept and print. And then they called me up and said, "Hey, Fritz, this is a great human interest story. What can we do here?" And I said, "Well, it's up to you." So they came around, they interviewed me, took some pictures, and lo and behold, I was in the paper, and they unfortunately put in my email address again. So I've been inundated with emails from the local community, of which I've not replied to any of them, so none of them knew that I was here tonight. I didn't want you all getting inundated, but at this hour, they probably would have already been gone. But there was a lot of support out there. There was nothing negative. Everyone just said, "Hey, I'd like to have chickens too. I'd like to have some fresh eggs." And, then I called the other towns, and there was no, there was, all of the neighboring towns allow poultry. There was very few restrictions. Manchester, a city, they allowed it, but you had to have an acre lot. And in the city of Manchester, that was kind of hard to come by, probably. But when I called Hudson, they just kind of laughed and said, "Absolutely. Yeah, well, we're kind of questionable on the roosters." Even in Manchester, he was just saying, "Roosters, well, that's a big problem." But all the rest of them, as you can see before you, they all just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Another town I called, Newton, which is out by Brentwood, Fremont, that area, they actually they didn't have any regulations. They allowed roosters, but only for 10 days a year. And I kind of chuckled and I said, "Wait a minute now." I said, "Are you talking 10 consecutive days? Yeah, you can have that. Or you can have 2 days each, 5 times a year. Or you can have, like this." And it's
Once a month.
for those that want to have little peeps, but we call those conjugal visits. Because you keep the hens happy. So anyway, they allowed it. But it seems as if Londonderry is the exception, is the island at this point, from the neighboring towns anyway, that don't allow the poultry, unless you have 2 acres or more. So I just thought it was kind of common sense here to perhaps revise our agricultural policy to keep it pretty much the same. Just take that word poultry out of there and then put some exceptions to that.
Yeah,
which I've
one, you can't get fresh eggs from Merrill's farm, if you really, without
I know.
having chickens.
There's a number of places over on
Yeah.
102, over in Derry,
Yeah.
on, what is that, Buttrick? Not Buttrick, but
Peabody Row.
Peabody Road.
yeah.
I think they have them
From,
too.
the Joderies. This predated, I think, a lot of people's times. Was a certain individual had created a disturbance with some farm animals, and as a result, the neighbors and neighborhood petitioned town meeting, and town meeting passed that ordinance. This is a long time ago, and it's stayed the same ever since.
And if the board recalls, there was actually a workshop discussion that was held a few years back when the zoning board had suggested several revisions to the ordinance. One of those sections was the agricultural section, and if you recall, we had a pretty large turnout of the agricultural community, which ultimately led to no changes being proposed to the livestock and agricultural section of the ordinance.
We wanted to make changes, we wanted to update it and everything, but we probably had 25, 30 people that did do farming in town and was opposed to anything and wanted things to stay the same. So we haven't touched it.
Yeah, but were we gonna restrict things more at that point in time? Or loosen them
it was
up?
a
I can
mix.
see people
Yeah,
complaining
it
about
was,
restricting it.
it was both. Some would be, there'd be more freedom, and other things would tighten up, and that was probably more, probably consistent with what other towns do, but it was soundly rejected as a very local meeting, and maybe my suggestion would be to talk to some of the local farmers first before you try changing anything, because you could be headed for the hornet's nest.
We're just doing conceptual discussion?
Yes.
So we can tell them what we think? I mean,
Yes. Yes.
I think it's a great idea, but I'm curious about why you say less than 1 acre, because the ordinance
I think that's a
requires you to
typo. It
have
should be
two-
less than 2 acres.
Less than 2 acres,
Yeah.
and I wonder if it might not be smart to put maybe a maximum per acre, so that if you have 1 acre, you could have up to whatever number. If you had 2 acres, maybe up to another number, and above 2 acres, maybe there wouldn't be a limit, but I really think there's a lot of people who would think this is a terrific idea, and the no rooster thing gets rid of the noisiness issue. I think it's great that you're bringing it forward. And maybe that's putting me on the bad side of the farmers too, but just
No,
No, I agree.
I agree with you. I have nothing against it. I was raised in the country, raised on a farm. But by the same token, even though your neighbors currently are all in favor of this, none of them are gonna complain, I can guarantee you, if this comes to fruition, that your neighbors half a mile away, or a mile away, or 2 miles away will be the ones that complain. It won't be the ones next door. It'll be the ones 2, 3 miles away. I don't want to get woke up in the morning. And yes, hens cackle. And they crow. So, I've seen it before. I've seen it other areas I've lived. Farms that have been there for years, and all of a sudden the develop goes up, and all of a sudden everybody's complaining about the noise from the chickens and the cows and the smell of the manure. Believe me, I love fresh eggs, and I don't mind it, but I know that's what'll happen.
One of the questions to the other towns, and I actually emailed them the survey, was have they had any complaints? The only complaints came through with roosters, and that was in Hudson and Derry. Manchester had a comment, said, yeah, you gotta be careful with them. Now, when you bring up the question of, well, what do you do with dogs? You're not restricted to the number of dogs, but, they're probably more of a noise factor than chickens. And chickens go perk, 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 but they don't crow. They don't. I've had hundreds of chickens, so I kind of know my chickens. So I think the neighbor issue, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not, there's people that are going to complain, and you guys see them here, all the time, so, but I don't know. I think that's minimal risk at this point.
If the board does want to go down the road of examining this, I can certainly work with Mr. Brown. One of the things I would suggest to the board is, rather than making this a use by right, meaning if you have less than 2 acres, if you have at least an acre, you can do chickens, it may make sense to add a level of scrutiny either through a special exception with the zoning board, so that there's at least a public noting,
Could be
public
public
hearing,
notice,
so there's
public
notice to
hearing.
the abutters, so there's a process there that allows people to understand that this is going to be proposed on the lot.
Yeah, I would suggest we go talk to Hank Peterson first.
I have a couple comments too.
He doesn't have chickens, does he?
I know he doesn't have chickens, but he'll give you his farm viewpoint of things. And buy some maple syrup from him also.
Well, diagonally across the street has chickens, though.
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
selling fresh eggs.
Yeah, but Hank was pretty vocal about changing any of our agricultural ordinance. And there's a lot of other people that were with him, so.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One, I just Googled poultry, and you end up with ducks and geese and peafowls and things like that, too. And so I think you would want to restrict it to chickens, because some of the other birds make noise, a lot more noise than chickens do. And then I would also think if, for under 2 acres, you would want to restrict the quantity so it's for personal consumption only. You know, if you have more than 2 acres, you can have a roost. No, and so you're not selling them out in your front yard, or you don't have a roost with 100 hens in it.
The state kicks in that. You can't do commercial. The state then has its own provisions for that. You have to have an 8-acre minimum for that.
For doing.
You come to the microphone, come to the microphone. Yeah, 'cause people watching, if they're watching at this hour, but they'll watch a replay of this anyway.
Rich Maynard, 10 Wilson Road. If you decide to go commercial, which means you're gonna be something more than 24 chickens or something like that.
I'm thinking the cooler out by your mailbox. You know, like Liberty Road, right?
Even that, I think there's limitations, but if you decide to go commercial, and the state has limitations of what you can do and how you can provide that, they even have provisions for trading with other people, you know. A lot of people can do that under the table, but the state has actual mandates for how you deal with that. But they come in, they say, you're gonna have a commercial operation, you need licenses, you need an 8-acre minimum, I believe, so. But I am in favor of this, changing this.
I never looked at the regulations, but I'm looking at what what poultry consists of, and if we're talking chickens, I think we should talk chickens and not poultry.
If I may continue?
Yes.
I'm actually in favor of expanding this a little more. I think about it as small livestock, and I do have some, there has been some studies by UNH as far as what you can support on a particular plot of land. Chickens are not particularly, area consuming. You can raise chickens on tens of square feet essentially. And I don't necessarily buy the fact that we might have neighbors complaining, miles away. I think about my plot, and I'm just short. I'm about 1 3/4 of an acre. And I think, well, if I just buy my neighbor's 1/4 of an acre and add to it, I could have chickens. So how does that change, My neighbors would still be complaining the same way, but now I'm within the provisions. I don't know if I buy it 100%. So, it's just my comment.
Anything else from the board?
It'd be awful expensive eggs if you had to buy a 1/4 acre.
Anyone from the public also, since Marty?
John had a comment over there.
Sorry, he can go first, though.
Fresh eggs,
It's gotta be the most
be
bizarre
ready for
thing
breakfast.
I've ever been to. Martin Suruga, 17 Wimbledon Drive. I'm sorry, but, it's bad enough I gotta put up with barking dogs, but cackling chickens, no. Last summer, my quiet afternoon was disturbed by a rooster that was crowing over by Shasta Road somewhere, which is about a 1/4 mile from my house. This is not a farm country right now. I love my suburban sprawl, the way it is. If I had my way, I'd probably ban dogs in town. But this is going too far. If the gentleman wants, and he's a very nice guy, and I'm sure he'll keep it clean and everything else, but I'm not concerned about, what's your name, first name? Fritz. Running a lousy operation. It's the 10 people after him that will not comply and will make a mess. Now, I did also Google the chickens. It's a fad. If everybody remembers the potbelly pig fad, the iguana fad, I think there were other couple animal fads that were out there, and unfortunately, many of these animals ended up in the shelters. A lot of these shelters are not equipped to deal with chickens or whatever they want to do with them, but I think this is just going too far. We have a 1-acre zone for a good reason. We don't want to start allowing more farm animals in. As you talked about, poultry includes a lot of different animals, and I think that's just too much. I really would not want a neighbor doing this. It's cute, it's nice for the grandchildren, but somewhere along the way, you got to say no, And I'm against this, I'm sorry, but I'd rather not see this start spreading all over town. If people want a farm, go buy a farm somewhere. You know,
Or
there's a lot of
2 acres.
acreage around, yeah, so buy it there.
Yeah. I think we have to think of it also, it's just not for this one individual or individual case.
No, it's
It
the 10 people after.
happens to, anyone can do it in town, so it could be a Pandora's box.
Hello,
Hey, Mike.
Mike Brown. Nice to meet you, Fritz Brown.
Are we related?
No, we're not.
Two Browns.
And Fritz is a well-spoken individual, and he pursued this in a good light. I wanted to speak to this from a couple standpoints and bring some balance to this, so to speak, in that 6 years that I served on the zoning board here in town, of the many, many, many cases we heard, the most contentious cases are cases like this, okay? Neighbor to neighbor. And it's got a lot to do with what Marty's talking about, and it's not whether it's right or wrong, it's just the way it is. And what happens is when an individual purchases a home in Londonderry, there's an expectation that when they purchase a residential property next to a residential property next to a residential property, that the types of activities that will take place are of that nature. Yes, Londonderry has a long-standing tradition of agricultural background, which is something that we all value, but we also know that it's in places where it's recognized and normal to take place. Over the course of serving for 6 years, what I found with this particular ordinance, and we had several cases dealing with this, is that the 2-acre minimum appears to have strike a really good balance in town. It works both ways as well. If I buy a property next to someone who has 2 acres or more, they have a right by our zoning ordinance to do this activity, and I have no right to complain about it because I bought my property and I should be well aware of the zoning requirements. The opposite is true as well, in that 1 acre buffer allows the protection equally to other neighbors. So I'm in favor of the current zoning ordinance because of my 6 years of experience, the fact that it's a slope that can become quite slippery quite quickly. Tim brought up a very, very important point in that I don't think it's wise for the planning board to sponsor a broad change to an ordinance like this based on an individual situation, with all due respect to Fritz, because he seems to be a very nice guy, okay? But you don't make a change like that for one person. It's not good planning, not good zoning. Tim brought up that if you wanted to pursue this, and I don't think you should, based on our track record with this, we have a very good ordinance. The other towns Fritz spoke about, I personally think should have one, but that's just my personal opinion based on my 6 years of doing this. Tim's approach of making this an exception-based decision, which is what the zoning board is in the first place. Fritz has an outlet to appeal this. He's probably looking at it and say, I don't have a chance in hell that this is going to pass, so I'm going to try this. I think he should try the zoning board. Maybe his property has some unique situation that would allow the zoning board to give him an exception to this. But I think if you're going to do anything, do it exception-based if you have to. I don't think you should, but I would avoid the broad brush change based on an individual's request. It's just not a good thing from a planning and zoning standpoint. And I can speak from experience in that we have a lot of individuals who would not be happy with this change based on what I saw over the course of time. Some would be happy with it, a lot wouldn't be. The workshop Tim talked about, I was on a zoning board, he was there. We were looking to make the current ordinance more restrictive, not lessen it. The 2 acres never came up. We were trying to add more animal management. The farmers ate us for lunch and told us, it's not broken, don't fix it. That included the 2 acre minimum because they see that the backyard farmer situation is not good for the true farmers and the animal management piece. So they were in favor of us leaving it for 2 reasons. That we were being overly restrictive, that the current one was working. So I think that's historical information. I'm glad Tim brought it up. Long-winded way of saying, I don't think you should change anything. If you decide to do this, I think you should go towards the exception-based and not do a broad-based change. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
I have a question for Mike.
Yes.
On your
I'm
tenure.
not on the zoning board anymore.
Yeah, on your tenure on the ZBA, how many cases did come, can be your recollection, obviously not.
Livestock-related cases?
Or specifically to keeping of chickens, and I suspect the main issue is roosters as well, right?
The number one most contentious issue were home businesses. People who were operating full-blown home businesses from home, not occupations.
Yeah.
Following that, there were, issues with livestock. I mean, in particular, there were several geese-related incidences because of the noise that they made.
Mhm.
Okay. Under every one of these circumstances, it typically was an individual who wasn't aware that we had zoning such as this. They just were doing it, and a neighbor didn't like it and called in, and then it was enforced after the fact. And so they came to the zoning board to ask for an exception. I would say there were 5, 6 of those cases. What I was trying to say, on a 6-year career, that's not a lot, but each one of them was very contentious.
Yeah.
Because there's an expectation to not have that living next to you when you buy a home in a residential neighborhood. There just isn't a normal expectation you would have that, even in a rural community like Londonderry. I guess there is in Manchester and Derry and Chester and so forth, so when you buy there, you get what they give you, which is no rules. I like our rule, so I don't know if that answers your question, though.
No, it does. And
Yeah.
was it Dana you said about Shasta or something? With a rooster on Shasta? Marty, yeah.
Marty.
He was there He was there 7 years ago. He was there 7 years ago when I lived on Shasta.
There's one other point that's a good point that Fritz brought up, in that yeah, dogs, that's a very common noise-related complaint that individuals have an outlet to handle through our noise ordinance and reporting that to the police, so you can manage that. But domestic pets, as defined in our ordinance, properly so. We have a proper definition of domestic pets, and it doesn't include poultry, because it shouldn't. They're not domestic pets, in my opinion, okay? That's a socially acceptable community standard that's been around for as long as we've been around. This would truly be an exception and not a normal activity. That's why we have these definitions, and that's why poultry's in the livestock definition, not the domestic pet.
So you feel like singling out
I feel we have it right.
chickens would be a slippery slope?
Yes, based on my experience. And the 2-acre gives property owners, it protects the property owners who have less than 2 acres, and it gives property owners who have more than 2 acres the right to do it. It's the right balance. It's not open-ended on either end.
I'd argue the 2 acres. I could hear the rooster, and he was about, 5 houses away from me, and I could hear him as plain as day.
Yeah. To Fritz's credit, he's specifically spelling out no roosters.
Yeah.
You need to be aware of how difficult and unenforceable this will get, and how quickly that will happen because of the nature of this, okay? So I'd be very careful about going down this road. That's all. I've talked too much. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this thing with any animals is noise and the smell.
Just one more thing to add. I did receive a phone call from a woman today that wanted to express her support for the change of the ordinance, who was also interested in doing this on her lot.
John?
I'm shocked at this one. I mean, this is live free or die stuff, right? I mean, what I just heard is, I appreciate Mike's comment, but I don't support the view. Fritz, I support your view. I see what you're after. I think we as a town and as an organization should move forward to look at the looking at chickens, not any other poultry or livestock or what have you. You know, my wife has also expressed interest in getting some chickens because I'm feeding 2 kids that eat, you know, a mountain of eggs, and it's quite amazing what the costs are. And I think if you look at the economic times that we're in and the cost of food, people are looking at alternative ways to be able to support their families. And I think this is something that we should put in front of our town, and we should look at. And I can understand the farmers not being happy to things, but I think from what I'm hearing, that the farmers were basically looking at a wider brush stroke than what we're talking about here. And I think if you polled a majority of the townspeople, I think you'd find a lot of people in support of Fritz. I think it's interesting that the research that he's done, and seeing that you know, we are the only surrounding town, we are the only town that's surrounded by everyone that allows us, including Manchester, which I was very shocked at. I don't understand why we don't move forward with this and we don't allow it. And it might be an exception rule, it might be, you know, how much land you have versus how many chickens you can have or something like that. But, I mean, clearly, I think it's time that we start looking at these alternative things and not just say, hey, you know, these are the rules and that's how we're gonna live. My 2 cents.
Thank you, John.
Anyone else from the board?
Yeah.
And you mentioned Hank Peterson, which I happened.
Yes, have a conversation with Hank.
His vote and mine, I think they're equal. Yeah, I'm not sure why Hank, I don't know why the other farmers come into this. Educate me here.
Yeah, I mean, that's, they just didn't want things changed, you know, they're fine with the way things
He's
were.
one person, I'm one person. So
Yeah.
all things
You're not
being
buying his
equal.
eggs.
Yeah,
You're not buying his eggs.
Well, how many farmers do we have in town versus how many people we have in town that aren't farmers?
yeah, I know when we had that hearing, we were quite surprised at the turnout that we had.
In at the flea market over on 102, there was an annual report there from Londonderry in 1951, so is that 60 years ago? There was 36,000 poultry here in Londonderry.
That was before there was zoning. No zoning.
Now they're all in Manchester.
Zoning didn't come to Londonderry until 1966.
Maybe
And then it was rather
maybe
contentious.
that's why zoning came in.
Yeah, that's usually what happens as the density starts increasing, neighbor complaints start increasing, and
Yeah, could be.
that's you know, what happens. I mean, we've had, I know in my tenure on the Board of Selectmen, several issues with individuals and their chickens and assorted animals and everything, and yeah, it's probably one of the reasons it gave rise to the,
Another public
yep,
member.
name and address, please.
Matt Norris from 28 Tokenell Drive. I came here also to talk about chickens. I find it interesting that, having lived here around 10 years now, all the stories in the papers are about goats, not chickens. A surprising number of them. Obviously, I think that the gentleman who spoke earlier about the point that I bought this house under these regulations, now these regulations change. I think that's a very valid point. I think the idea that if I've got 2 acres, I can put a cow and a horse on it, that's, you know, over 2,000 pounds of livestock next to another home versus 10 pounds of chickens. I'm not sure that those are in the same league. I believe that this is worth looking at, but, and this is a general question, is that as a planning board, making this decision for all the homeowners who tonight, when they went to sleep, they know that there's no chickens next door and there won't be tomorrow. Would this be something that should be brought up in another avenue as something that's voted on?
Just to give you an idea process-wise, how this would happen. Right now, it's a conceptual discussion. Should the planning board support making changes, they would direct me to work with Mr. Brown to come up with some ordinance language. We'd likely have a workshop on that ordinance. There would then be a public hearing here with the planning board, who would then make a recommendation to the town council. Town council ultimately has the final authority on voting in changes to zoning ordinance. They would hold their own public hearing and take the final vote.
That's what I wanted to know.
So it would not come before the town?
It does not go to town meeting.
Come before the town council.
Town council has the authority to make
Does
changes
the
to
town
zoning.
council have the authority to choose to bring it in front of the town instead?
Not under our charter.
Can a citizen petition go to the deliberative session?
That would, no, a
No.
petition for a zoning change, if you had 25 signatures, it would go to the council, who would refer it to the planning board, who would then make a recommendation back to the council.
Okay.
Sounds like you could get you 25 people.
But also within the town council, there's a process, you could initiate action through there, or if the council's taken action you don't like, you can collect enough signatures, and that could end up, either brought to town council.
The
or
main
go for the
difference
whole town
between
for a vote.
doing it the way it's happening right now is if for whatever reason the planning board does not support it, it dies there. Whereas if you go the petition route, regardless of what the planning board feels, there will be a recommendation, the council will have a hearing on it.
Okay, Rick?
If you go ahead with something what John was saying, just wanna add, maybe change it to the acre and a half, it would still exclude quite a bit of residential houses. You know, he has 1.7 acres, he said, and he could get his chickens.
No, that was that gentleman.
You only have 1 acre? Okay, I tried.
Thanks anyway.
Get it to one. I need one,
Good try,
too.
Rick.
Well, I was just, you know, if you didn't wanna
You
go
have
the
to
whole
recuse
broad
yourself, John.
Yeah.
stream there at an acre and a half, you know, you kinda going in between, but.
Okay, so who was supportive of change? Oh,
Could I just say something? I don't know if I'm the only dissenting opinion on this board, but Mr. Brown, I appreciate you coming before the board and speaking so eloquently.
Thank you.
And, you know, your ideas are clearly sane. I mean, it makes sense in today's world. I don't dispute that at all. Having 3 kids who eat a lot of eggs, yeah, I could completely concur. However, I have a property in town that's 2.7 acres, I believe, in a neighborhood of similar lot sizes, and frankly, I wouldn't have bought. I know they have the right to have livestock, but I'm one of those people who the other Mr. Brown talked about, who I would not have bought here if I had known that I'd hear chickens next door. I suppose that's luck on my part that my neighbors don't have it, since they're well within their right to have them with the acreage that we have in our neighborhood. But I just wanted to make my opinion known.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if you find a chicken on your front yard tomorrow.
Perhaps.
Might have to develop some regulations so they aren't wandering in the neighbor's yard and across the street and,
Well, they'd be contained, he's got.
Stuck in the middle of 93.
yeah.
So what I'm looking for from the board is direction as to whether or not I should pursue anything on this or not.
Okay, who at least, raise your hand, who sides with what Fritz has proposed?
I'm going to raise my hand. I think we should investigate and have a public hearing, and if people don't want it, then we'll hear about it.
Okay.
I agree.
I get 1, 2, 3. 3 out of 9. My recommendation would be to pursue the ZBA.
Does it die with the ZBA if you don't get an exception?
It would be a variance, it would not be an exception in this circumstance, because right now, there is no special exception written into the
Okay,
ordinance to
so,
allow
I mean,
for
if he doesn't get a variance, does it die there? Or does he have the right to appeal to the
He-
town council?
No, there's no appeal rights on a variance, you would have to appeal to Superior Court.
Okay.
But could he start over with a petition?
Sure. You can do a petition at any time.
So then he wouldn't have to go to Superior Court, he could do a petition and go to the
You
town
could do a
council?
petition for the zoning change, but again, at that point, he'd need to have specifically what he'd want in the ordinance.
Right.
And that would then be presented to the council, who would refer it to the board for a recommendation, and then back to the council.
Okay.
See you in 3 months.
We all like our fresh eggs and everything, but, I mean, I think in the past, Londonderry voters have spoken, and I think
appreciate
even
your
though you
time.
find some people have similar opinions, I think you get to the larger town, you probably find that they might think it's a great idea, but if they hear, men making noise or something, all it takes is one neighbor to be disturbed by it, even though they might be supportive of it at this stage. But
Thank you for your time.
You're welcome, and thank you for coming anyway. You know,
You're welcome. Sorry to hold you up so late.
No, that's our job.
That's why we're here.
Mr. Chairman,
No, they lost.
I don't see anybody here for the final conceptual discussion, so
Quarter past
I
12.
will
That's-
move
my
that to
clock
the
is wrong.
meeting on June 8th.
Okay.
Is it really quarter past?
Okay, any further business for the planning board?
Motion to adjourn.
I have a motion to adjourn. I have a second by Mary.
Wait, don't we have
All those in
another one?
favor signify by saying aye.
Nobody here for it.
Aye.
Don't we have
We're
the other one?
adjourned.
I don't know why that isn't on there.
L Town Garage.